G'day YouTube, Warbles on a lot here. The Bat Eaters Lament virus is lurking everywhere. The Bat Eaters Lament virus, it could be anywhere. The Bat Eaters Lament virus, death is in the air. So what you gonna do about it? Why not pay attention to an old school mask Nazi? The last of the old school hospital trained registered general nurses. Right at the moment, there are a lot of debates going on within society, within polite society, within not quite so polite society. There are debates concerning whether the vaccine is a good idea or a bad idea. There are debates concerning whether social distancing, self-isolation, lockdown, quarantine is necessary or useful. There are debates concerning whether masks are worth wearing or whether it's all just theatre. Well, not all the trees in the forest die when there's a drought. The trees don't get any choice in the matter. If their roots are stuck in a shallow crack in the underlying bedrock, then they die when the ground dries out. To a certain degree, during a pandemic, some people can be like a lucky tree, in the sense that whereas the trees can have their roots stuck in a deep crack where there's lots of water at the bottom of the crack and they can get through the drought not quite untouched, but they live. Some people, by the randomness or otherwise of the genetic lottery which determines who breeds with who, they can have an immune system that's particularly good at dealing with a coronavirus that's come to humans from bats. There are people who debate whether that's what happened, but there's no evidence supporting any other hypothesis. There is evidence supporting the hypothesis suggesting that the Bat Eaters Lament virus came from the bats, specifically from the Wuhan horseshoe bats, which used to live peacefully in their caves fairly remote from human civilization. And then, owing to the miracle of modern technology and economic theory, the population surrounding them, population of humans surrounding them grew. People within the cities became sufficiently rich as to eat pretentious, high-value food, rare food, stuff that their ancestors would have only eaten under desperate circumstances, in the same way that some people boil birds' nests in order to rehydrate the snot that's used as glue to hold the sticks together, and they drink that as bird's nest soup, and that's a delicacy. Yeah, well, deep-fried, de-gutted, beheaded bat is apparently a delicacy in your soup in that part of China. So the bats bugger the mobile phone, scourge of the modern existence. As I was saying, the bats became stressed. When they became stressed, their immune system failed to cope with the small normal load of coronavirus that were in the bats. The viruses bred up within the bats. My personal hypothesis will never remain anything more than a hypothesis because it can't be tested and make a testable prediction. My personal hypothesis is that somebody who was keeping bats and pangolins, as the bats were sold, they de-gutted the bats and threw the bat, probably the heads and the guts, to the pangolins which are forest floor omnivores. Thus, fresh, hot, live bat virus got inside a pangolin. And then they butchered the pangolin, or the pangolin coughed in their face. But somehow, my hypothesis of the bat butcher gutting a bat and feeding the entrails to a pangolin, that's the best hypothesis, which complies with William of Ockham's razor in that it does not multiply entities unnecessarily. I don't have to invoke laboratories full of workers, technicians, professors, all trying to weaponize an existing natural virus. I don't have to invoke a laboratory full of workers attempting to observe natural viruses to see what might be the next thing that's going to come out of these bats that 10 years ago gave us the original SARS, sudden acute respiratory syndrome, which was a coronavirus that came out of the bats in China. The entrepreneurial bat butcher hypothesis merely assumes that everybody gets on with their day trying to do their best at making money and maintaining their position within society. Perhaps advance a little bit. On the topic of how and why the coronavirus, the SARS-CoV-2, sudden acute respiratory syndrome, coronavirus 2, second edition, why it came out and became COVID, coronaviral disease 2019, how it got out. For that, we'd have to go back to what I was told in 1A block, which is, they call it practical procedures block. You do your 2 months in PTS, preliminary training school, you go out onto the wards for a couple of months, you come in for block 1A, and it's a 10-day block on practical procedures like doing dressings. So therefore they had to teach the first year student nurses something about microbiology so that aseptic dressing technique would make sense to us. Whereas the first time I was in PTS in July to September 1980, I was at Tamworth Base Hospital and they didn't run to having a professor of microbiology on tap to talk to the student nurses. At Concord Repat, they had a professor of microbiology. And after he'd run us through the basics and taught us how not to infect the patients, we got on to the hot topic of the day, which was multi-resistant Staphylococcus aureus. And we were told, in passing by a professor of microbiology, that he vehemently disagreed with the hospital board's stated position to the effect that they didn't need to have a dedicated staff nursing unit. He said they want you to nurse staff patients behind fabric curtains hanging on the rails that you would normally use to get privacy for a bedpan. He said that's just going to spread staph through the whole ward. But he wasn't high enough up the food chain to fix things. I was high enough up the food chain, or low enough down the food chain actually, because I got sent to a surgical ward after that block. Cut a long story short, on a Friday afternoon I was supposed to special one patient with a positive staph swab test. On the Saturday morning I was looking after a room full of 6 people, and I was supposed to work there while somebody else specialed the bloke I'd had the previous night, and I had 2 other patients who had a positive staph swab result. During that shift and the next shift on the Sunday, I shifted patients around with different charge nurses, and I was the lowest of the low first year student nurse. So no registered nurse was responsible for deciding to alter things. So when the charge nurse showed up on Monday, she had the Concord Repatriation General Hospital dedicated MRSA barrier nursing unit in the back bay of Ward 610. She vowed to get rid of it. She said it was going to go away. She was going to cure those patients, clean them up and ship them out and then carbolized the back bay, and it was going to go back to being Ward 610 male abdominal surgical ward. 3 years later, I left the hospital. The MRSA unit was still there. I think it was 3 years after that, I heard on the radio that it had got a permanent funding tranche that had been remodeled and renamed to the Dirty Burns unit. So now if you got a burn and you got an infection, you go to the Dirty Burns unit that this particular masked Nazi set up 40 years ago when I was a fresh little student nurse, a first year trainee student. So the other thing that this professor of microbiology told us was that all the microbiologists all around the world were shitting themselves with fear. They were terrified. He said what they were terrified of was the prospect of a novel, that means new, zoonotic, comes from animals, viral pneumonia, which would have 5% or less death rate, 1 to 5%. He said it could go as high as 15%, but we'd notice it then. He said if it was like Ebola, you'd notice it really fast. If it was like Marburg virus, you probably wouldn't notice that at all because it used to kill 99% of everybody who got it, and it would wipe out a whole village before anybody could run away and tell the next village to be frightened. Ebola, yeah, you notice when suddenly you got patients coming in and bleeding to death out through their eyeballs, and only, like 4 out of 10 survive with the best nursing you can come up with. But he said if you got a virus that only kills 1 to 5%, and bear in mind, the 1919 flu pandemic only killed 1%. But it was highly transmissible and they didn't know about viruses, so it killed a bloody lot of people because a bloody lot of people caught it. On the other hand, in 1919, they did not have jumbo jets. He said if a boatload of returning soldiers come back to Australia, we could put them in a figure 8 off the heads, 3 miles out to sea, 10 miles out to sea. Make them stay there for a month, and if nobody had any flu at the end of the month or had any flu for a fortnight, all right, you can let them come back, come and birth in Australia. So with that virus, it was a flu virus, and they do mutate to become less deadly. Coronaviruses don't. Our immune system evolves to deal with them. That's why there's never been a vaccine against the common cold, because 6-8 months down the track, you need a different vaccine. Not totally different, but different. Got to tweak it. Yeah, well, we've got a coronavirus to deal with. What he said he was worried about 40 years ago was this mythical novel zoonotic pandemic viral pneumonia, which in a third world or underdeveloped country where overcrowded people lived in close proximity with overcrowded animals, tick, 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 Wuhan, China. He said, nobody will notice what's going on until at least 2 or 3 hospitals adjoining in a city or something like that, till those hospitals have their intensive care wards develop bed block. He said if they get bed block and then the nurses and the doctors start getting sick, by the time the first of the respiratory physicians starts to die, that's when they'll realise what's happening, and they'll talk to the microbiologists and the epidemiologists and the virologists, and they'll get onto the case. That's what I was told. And he said it's not like the days when we had Sunderland flying boats, or Empire class flying boats, and Lockheed Constellations, and only very few very rich people flew by air. He said once the 707 was invented, now we got the 747. He said apprentice hairdressers' assistants and telephone sanitisers can afford to fly to Bali for a clap catching expedition every year. People go to England and back for a holiday. He said the international airline tourism industry will carry that novel pandemic zoonotic viral pneumonia all around the world before anybody in the country it originates in has the slightest idea of what's going on. That's what I was told 40 years ago. Last week I heard on the radio somebody saying that if it wasn't for the fact that we've got fragile, authoritarian, egomaniacal semi-dictators in charge of places like China and the USSR, the Philippines, Brazil, England, America when Trumpy was in. This fella said if COVID-19 had come along, with SARS-CoV-2, if it had come along 25 years ago, it wouldn't have spread around the world as easily as it did, because 25 years ago, the community medical officer in Wuhan would have had the balls to tell people in Peking, listen, something bad is going on here. We've got a novel viral pneumonia. We don't know how to treat it. Our ICUs are full and the staff are starting to die. But those provincial district authorities in Xi Jinping's authoritarian, dictatorial, dear leader for life type regime, they didn't have the guts to say anything. They had to keep tourism numbers up, to keep commercial turnover up for the Christmas and the New Year and the Chinese New Year period. They thought that was their priority. The secret police thought their priority was to lock up any of the doctors who said there was a problem. It's the hard, authoritarian, dictatorial, top-down chain of command. That's what's got us into this problem as badly as we've got into it. And then we have all kinds of other side games going on. One of my pet theories is that, based on the observed fact that before COVID, it was an offence at law to wear a mask on the Hong Kong streets, because the Chinese government didn't want anyone wearing masks because that would defeat their facial recognition video surveillance technology. I'm wondering how much of the anti-mask hysterical propaganda is coming from the video surveillance facial recognition community. In all countries of the world, they don't want people wearing masks because it means that they've just wasted the last 20 years of developing technology to recognize individuals by looking at the shape of their nose in relation to their mouth in relation to their eyes. That's a gentle little conspiracy theory of my own. I don't know how you would prove it except by digging into people's emails. There's a hot tip if you have the technology and the desire to spend years of your life trying to prove an hypothesis, which is another word for brain fart. You know, in the scientific method of problem solving, the chain of events occurs in you have an observation which you find anomalous. You've got an anomalous observation. If you are of such a curious mental bent, you will try and explain that anomaly. Whatever you think up to explain that anomaly is called an hypothesis. If the hypothesis is utterly ridiculous, you can discard it and pluck another one out of the sky or out of your backside, because the number of hypotheses with which to explain a possible anomaly, any possible anomaly, is officially infinite. There is no limit to how many hypotheses you can dream up if you care to. In order to get to be a theory, you have to be able to make a prediction which is testable. So you run the experiment. A hypothesis didn't work, it stays a hypothesis. Oh, look at that, we made a prediction and we're within 10% of the predicted value in the result, therefore this is now a theory and we have to replicate the experiment to see whether it happens again. Off and running. Now you've got a theory. So I've got an hypothesis, which I cannot personally test, so it remains a hypothesis. Part of the boo-hoo sob about masks is because the video surveillance community doesn't want people wearing masks. Which brings me to the actual point of this video and why I'm in this get-up. Yes, having a pane of glass in front of your eyeballs, that will protect you against droplet infection. The idea that somebody on the other side of a 4-metre gap coughs and a little discrete droplet of spit with viruses in it flies across. The glasses won't actually protect me very much from a free-floating virus on a water molecule in the air, you know, like comes out on the water vapor in the expired breath. A mask works as a filter if it's a good mask. If it's a N95 P2 barrier nursing, infection control rated mask, which is what I'm wearing. See, it works as a filter. The air goes in and out through the mask. The goggles don't fog up. It's not leaking. A good mask, properly worn, which means I don't pet it and touch it and fondle it and tickle it and play with it. I put it on when I'm in a clean area, and I take it off when I'm leaving the contaminated zone, and I've got correct facilities to divest myself of the PPE. 90% of the medical and nursing staff who catch Ebola catch it in the change room when they make a mess of getting out of their protective personal equipment. So you've got to wear your mask properly, and it helps if you've got a good mask. As this mask Nazi said, I think it was Wednesday, but it might have been Monday, in the supermarket, and I was at one cashier and I saw a bloke at another cashier, and he went through putting his stuff on the conveyor belt. Big tall fella, you know, head taller than me, half my age, quite well muscled. He went there and he turned around and he looked to see if anyone was close to him. And he pulled his bloody 20-cent or 50-cent surgical mask off under his nose. And he looked around again. He couldn't see anyone. And then he pulled it under his bloody chin and tried to chat up the checkout chook. That wasn't a checkout chick. He must be into granny porn, you know, but he was trying to have this flirtatious conversation, I think. Maybe I am projecting. Maybe he was just talking to her. Maybe he wanted to prove his point that he can go without a mask because he has freedom. Anyway, I had 2 loaves of bread in one hand and a litre of cat milk in the other hand to go and deliver to my daughter's pussycat. And my walking stick was under my arm, so I knew I did not present a visible threat. I wasn't threatening in any way. Twice his age, head shorter, both hands occupied. Therefore, I couldn't resist going and talking to him. Now, I didn't get all authoritarian and finger waggy. I said, "Excuse me, mate." And he looked down at me. And I said, "Listen, I don't want to give any offence, but the thing is that there surgical mask you're wearing, it's not actually designed to be particularly good at barrier nursing or infection control. So you can't expect it to work miracles, but if you're going to give it its very best chance to do what it's designed to do, then you've got to wear it above your nose." "Oh," he says, and pulls it up above his nose. "Sorry," he says, and goes to turn away. And I said, "Now, that's a lot better than having it under your chin, mate. But now what you got to do is you need to reach up with your 2 forefingers, and you need to locate the 2 little bits of pliable, malleable, bendable wire that are embedded in the paper on the top edge of the mask. Now I want you to push the mask in its most comfortable up-down position against your nose and your cheekbones, and make the mask conform to the shape of your individual personal face. So it's just your mask, and it's now dedicated its whole working life to making sure that you don't suck virus-laden air in under your eyeballs, on top of your nose when you breathe in." And he looked at me and he reached up and he pushed the bit of wire, and I don't know, he may have been acting, or maybe he's never realised that that's what you're supposed to do with a bit of wire. Anyway, he didn't bar up and he didn't get and cranky with me. He said thank you, and I got on with my day and he got on with his day. So yeah, that's the masked Nazi part. That's what you can say in the supermarket if you go about it right. You got to make it clear from the start that you're not threatening anybody with anything. You're just assuming that they were not aware of the optimum way to use the equipment that they've got. And you can put in a plug for getting a better mask too. Which brings me to the point of mask efficacy. Now what we're trying to do, politicians aside, they're trying to open up the economy, and they're trying to say that because the vaccines are surprisingly good at preventing infected individuals from suffering a severe illness. Also surprisingly good at preventing infected individuals from dying. Therefore, the politicians have been told by the business as usual lobby from the Chamber of the Horrors of the Commerce that what needs to happen, air quotes, scare quotes, needs to happen, is that we should open up for business As soon as we've got 70% of the eligible population vaccinated, which translates as 56% of the entire population of New South Wales, anyway, vaccinated, double vaccinated, because then if they catch the virus, they won't get sick enough to go to hospital, and if they get sick enough to go to hospital, then they probably won't need an intensive care bed, and if they go to intensive care, they probably won't die. And the latest figures from the American CDC, Centers for Disease Control, that come out of my radio this morning, suggests that if you are double vaccinated, that means that you will have 1/4, 4-to-1, the people who are unvaccinated have 4 times the infection rate when they are exposed to the virus. Unvaccinated gives you 4 times the infection rate. So if there's 5 viruses floating in the air and you are vaccinated, you'll catch one of them. You'll get away from the first 4, but you'll catch one. It's got the vaccine will stop you from getting 80% of the viruses. That's good, right? Okay. That's when you are 10 days, 2 weeks after your second vaccination. After that, the vaccine's efficacy drops off by about 8% per month. And after 8 months, when you're down to about 40% efficacy, so now if there's 10 viruses in the room, you're going to catch 6 of them. So you might as well say that between the high point and the low point, the efficacy of the vaccine is around 60%. In broad terms, just good enough for arguing about over a drink in the bar. Because at the end of the 8 months, then you need a booster. So we might as well say that you vary between the 40 and 80%. So 60% is a good all-round figure to talk about. The vaccine will stop you from getting 6 out of 10 viruses when you meet them in the street, across the street, in the car park, in the supermarket. Make sense? Good. However, a mask, a good mask, properly worn, without any of the pitfalls of playing with it or pulling it off every time you go in and out of shop, just got you, mosquito. A good mask properly worn, it'll protect you from 65% of the viruses you encounter. So it's ahead, right? A good mask on average is better than being double vaccinated and going through that sine curve cycle of being boosted every 8 months. A good mask does better than a vaccine at stopping you from becoming infected. If you are infected, the current best evidence indicates that if you're infected with Delta virus, being vaccinated doesn't make any difference to you being contagious. If you rely on the vaccine and then you get the virus, you will be as infectious as someone who is not vaccinated. And because of the R number of this thing, anywhere from 5 to 18, depending on who you listen to, the idea that being vaccinated is going to, having 70% of society vaccinated, or 80% of society vaccinated, or 90% of society vaccinated, that's not going to stop the virus from circulating in the community among the people who are half vaccinated, the people who are not vaccinated for whatever reason, whether it's a medical reason or whether it's an imaginary reason, whether it's hesitancy, whether it's generalized paranoia. There are always going to be some people unvaccinated, and some of the viruses are developing the ability to get past the vaccines. And I may be wrong about this because I'm not a virologist, but it seems to me that if you're double vaccinated, you meet 10 viruses, 4 of them set up housekeeping and start breeding inside your respiratory tract. When you start shedding virus, you're going to be shedding the latest, greatest virus, which has just defeated the vaccine-augmented human immune system. You're not going to be shedding one of the viruses that got cleaned up by your boosted immune system. You're going to be shedding high-grade virus. So because in the long run, the end game of humanity should not be prioritising the economy. See, I told you I'd get you. The end game of humanity should be exterminating the virus before the virus mutates into something that can exterminate us. And that's where masks come in, because if you've got a good quality mask, it's going to prevent 95% of any viruses that you've got from going out there and infecting other people. Even if you breed a superbug, if you mechanically stop it with the filter element of your mask over the top of your nose and your face, you have done your duty for humanity. You've been a good little citizen. If, on the other hand, you don't give a shit, if you don't care what the science is, if you want to live in a contradictory, counterfactual universe, you can, by your reckless, careless, unthinking negligence, you can infect and harm and damage and kill other people. In the city of Sydney at the moment, there is a limousine driver who was employed specifically to drive international aircrew from the airport where they touched down in his limousine to the quarantine hotel where they were going to sleep overnight before going back and flying away again. And because his employment contract, which might have been signed years before COVID, did not stipulate that he had to wear a mask, therefore he said it was his right not to be masked. He also didn't apply for the vaccine, which back then didn't really mean a lot, because not a lot of people were applying to get vaccinated in Australia, because we didn't have much virus in Australia till he brought it in. He personally inoculated Sydney with the virus. He infected Sydney with the virus. The viral strain that he brought from his airline crew passengers and let loose in Bondi, that's now killed 200 citizens of New South Wales. They're now getting, I think today was 1,599 new cases. If he had decided, made a free choice decision, because he's a free human, if he'd used his freedom to decide to do a line of cocaine up one nostril, a line of speed or ice up the other nostril, if he then decided to drink half a bottle of whiskey and set sail on the wrong side of the road at twice the speed limit, if he'd hit 2 school buses and sent them burning into a kindergarten, if he'd managed to kill 200 people with his freedom choice on the highway, everybody he killed, he would be getting the equivalent of a manslaughter charge in terms of 15 years maximum head sentence for negligently, culpably causing that death, even though he might not have been doing anything deliberately trying to kill any one of them. He has negligently and recklessly taken action which he knew could cause harm or death to other people, and he's gone and flaming well done it anyway. I don't understand why he's walking the streets with a $500 fine for not wearing a mask or something. Like ex-Prime Minister Tony Abbott was fined for not wearing a mask. Barnaby Joyce has been fined for not wearing a mask. Adam Marshall has already had COVID. And Adam Marshall is trying to dismantle all forms of restriction on trade and travel and commerce for the sake of preventing the virus from breeding. These lunatics don't want anybody to wear a mask because it has a depressing effect on the economy, apparently, or it makes it difficult for your video surveillance technology to keep track of who's going where. I would have thought that humanity's priority when faced with the exact, precise, novel, zoonotic, pandemic, viral pneumonia, which my professor of microbiology predicted 40 years ago, I would think humanity's priority should be to exterminate the virus as soon as possible before the virus exterminates us. because it appears to me to be perfectly set up to do it. It's set up too well for any person working in a laboratory to have done it, because we don't know enough to do that. All the people who say, oh, the virus must have been bloody designed in a lab, look what it does. No, it's like the idiot who tried to tell me that, oh, the vaccines are specifically designed to only deal with the symptoms. No, not that either. The vaccines are designed to show the human immune system, this is what the virus looks like. When you see this, start making antibodies as soon as possible. Don't wait for that virus to get into a cell and kill the cell and show up in the millions. That's all the vaccines are designed to do. The success with which they avoid you getting symptomatic illness is a reflection of how fast your immune system responds to seeing the first virus it meets. Whether the virus established itself in your cells or not is a factor of how well the virus is evolving under the selective evolutionary pressure we're putting it under by vaccinating people in piecemeal penny packets. As the vaccine becomes available, we're pumping it out there, which means that while vast numbers of the people are unvaccinated, the virus is getting a chance to basically sharpen its teeth on all of our vaccines. So I don't know how tragicomic, sad-ass, glad-ass, Berejiklian's plan to reopen New South Wales as soon as 70% of the eligible adult population has been vaccinated will turn out to be, but the entire medical nursing community and industry is already screaming for her to be taken out the back and re-educated and have it explained to her that you cannot count on everybody who ever trained as an ICU nurse or a doctor to work 27 hours in every 24-hour day just to keep all of the beds that you're going to require staffed. People burn out. And for the last, I'd say 35 years, there has been an unrelenting succession of bean counting, penny pinching decisions made by departments of health in order to reduce the number of staff working on the ground, on the roster, familiar with everything in the hospital and the routines, who are able to cope with a sudden surge in patients. When I was working as a nurse, my job was charge nurse, sister in charge of the hospital. The hospital was a 24.5 bed hospital. We had a 1.5 bed maternity unit. So that brings us down to 23. We had 5 acute general beds. We had something like 15 long stay geriatric beds, and the rest was respite beds. So people in the community who had an aged relative could stick them in hospital for a week and go to the coast and have a swim, come out from under the unrelenting pressure. What I found, as I said to a pharmacist one day, I didn't understand why it was that as soon as you get 21 patients, that place just falls to pieces. It's perfectly good fun to work there with 19 patients or less. If you got 20 patients, everything's humming like a Swiss watch or a sewing machine with a foot flat, you know. You're working all the time, but you can do everything. Nobody's getting shortchanged. Hit it with the 21st patient and you're up shit creek. And he looked at me and he said, oh, yeah, that's because Hunter New England Regional Health has a policy of only staffing all their hospitals for 75% of their stated bed capacity. So you've got a 25 bed hospital, you've got enough nurses for 20. That was in 1986, and it's been getting worse ever since. 35 years going down the tubes to the point where there is no surge capacity, especially not locally employed nurses and doctors out in regional New South Wales. So when sad ass Berejiklian decides that she's going to reopen for the sake of the economy. Everybody who's not vaccinated, good friggin' luck, mate, because this is, at this point, it's a disease of the unvaccinated, and the CDC says not only are you 4 times less likely to catch COVID if you are vaccinated, if you are vaccinated and you catch it, you are 11 times less likely to die. 1,100% less likely to die from COVID if you are vaccinated than if you are unvaccinated and you catch it. And if you're unvaccinated, you got 400% the chance of catching it than if you were vaccinated. So it is literally your choice, you know, like if you're an absolute fervent vax denialist, well, you know, prepare to die while you got the faith, because the Grim Reaper is coming for you. There's virus in the air. There's virus everywhere. The Bat Eater's Lament virus is not joking. We're going to need social isolation, social distancing, quarantines, lockdowns, masking all of the time, as well as vaccines, if we are to have any hope of eliminating, exterminating the virus before it reduces humanity to such a negligible remnant that the survivors can't walk far enough before they run out of food to find each other to breed. Because that is when a virus exterminates itself. Therefore, pay attention to the masked Nazis. The masked Nazis are the people who actually know what they're talking about. The people who are squeaking and preaching about freedom and the right to make your own bad choices. What they are effectively is compost on the hoof. Hopefully they guide themselves and find a nice rock upon which to artistically drape themselves. Sorry, I just got presented with a screen I didn't want to see. And then, after draping themselves artistically on the rock, when COVID kills them, they can compost and rot down and become topsoil, and they might not be pushing up daisies, but with luck, they can push up a food plant, perhaps. See, that one grows berries you can eat. You can eat the roots of that one. And that one has pink flowers. Not all the trees die when there's a drought. Some do survive. Not all the people die when there's a plague. Some do survive. But you have to do what you can. You have to take the best available options. It's a bad idea to live in a counterfactual universe. Get yourself vaccinated. Get onto the best quality supply of masks that you can afford. Figure out how to re-sterilise them, because you never know when you're not going to be able to get them again. And practice scrupulous mask discipline. If you can get onto any teaching material concerning barrier nursing and reverse barrier nursing, barrier nursing being when you don't want the patient to infect you. Reverse barrier nursing, you don't want to infect the patient. Either which way, having a good quality face mask, wearing it properly, respecting the fact that it can only help you contain the infection, whichever way you're trying to contain it, the mask can only help you contain the infection if you give it a chance to work as designed. If you walk around all day in a contaminated area and you've got 50 viral particles on each side of your mask, and then you decide that you're home, so you grab the mask by the front and pull it off and throw it on the floor because you're sick of wearing a mask, Congratulations, you've now got the virus on your hand. Never touch a surface that you suspect is contaminated. Yes, you can have a laugh at the masked Nazi. But the point is, nothing I've said within this video is bullshit. And here's a bit of foreshadowing. What do you see there? Do you see the reason? Why, I'm very, very certain that this place is a didgeridoo factory, because so many of the trees have died and regrown before. My firewood is typically made up of didgeridoos, just waiting to be picked up. So, I might be an old masked Nazi, but I'm not as silly as I look, and I'm not often wrong. Warbles on a lot to YouTube. Ciao.